Hello there and welcome to the third in our series Back to the Start, looking at the opening chapters of the Bible and trying to understand what they have to say to us now about the world as it is, the world as we experience it, and our responses and reactions to it. Last time we looked at how in creation God brings order and shape where there was chaos and darkness, and how that's a pattern really for his work in our lives and his pattern in the world going forwards, his work in the world going forwards and continuing to today. But I want to carry on looking at the rest of Genesis chapter 1 today, and it's the 6 days of creation. Maybe it's something we've read lots of times, maybe it's something we've looked at, and again, as I mentioned earlier, our focus has been, did it really happen like that? How does that fit in with science and all those sort of things? I want to look beyond that a little bit and think about what it says to us about God and how he works and the world. One thing I would say, I said I wouldn't get into this, but just by way of prelude, is it's really interesting the sequence of events that's presented in Genesis 1 and where life begins. Not wanting to make too much of a point of this, but it's not so different from the account that we hear from science these days, that actually the first life that God creates happens in the water. It's the fish and the birds of the air at the same time, before you get onto mammals and before you get onto human life. Actually, that sequence isn't so different from the one that evolution describes. So make of that what you will. I just thought it's an interesting observation. But that's not what I want us to think about mainly today. I want us to think about what God does and actually about the sheer diversity of life that God creates. It is quite extraordinary. I'm going to read a few verses. I'm not going to read all of it, but basically we're thinking about Genesis chapter 1, verse 3 down to verse 25. And it starts off, God said, "Let there be light." And then he separated the waters above from the waters below and made the sky and the ocean. And then God said, verse 11, "Let the land sprout with vegetation, every sort of seed-bearing plant, and trees that grow seed-bearing fruit. These seeds will then produce the kinds of plants and trees from which they came." And that is what happened. Just a little thing there that I want to pick up again later on. "Let the waters swarm," verse 20, "with fish and other life. Let the skies be filled with birds of every kind." So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that scurries and swarms in the water, and every sort of bird, each producing offspring of the same kind. And then a similar process with the livestock and the small animals. God made all sorts of wild animals, verse 25, livestock and small animals, each able to produce offspring of the same kind. It might seem like a small point, but actually I think it's quite huge. God creates life, but he doesn't create the finished product. He doesn't create, this is it. He creates it with the seed, literally, the ability to reproduce itself. So God doesn't create something that's static. Right from the start, the world is meant to be dynamic. Change is built into the structure of the universe as God created it, because there's room for growth, there's room for development, there's room for animals, plants to reproduce of the same kind that God originally made them. Now, I think that's quite fascinating and quite an interesting take on what God does. He doesn't finish it off and say, there you are, completed. He produces something, he creates something with the ability to develop and grow and become more and fill the earth, as we'll see later on. So God, if you like, starts on a smaller scale with the hope, the desire, the purpose that it will grow and fill. That, I think, again, is a picture of how God often works with us. We so often want him to do the complete job, to basically tie up all the loose ends, and with us left with nothing to do because God's done it all. But I think more often than not, this creation pattern is seen in God's dealings with us as people. It's seen in his dealings with the world. He starts something off and creates in it the ability for it to grow and develop and become all he wants it to be, all he wants you to be, me to be. He doesn't just snap his fingers and make it happen, but he plants the seeds. Now, on the big cosmic scale, when you're talking about creation, we've got to be a little bit careful here. There's an old heresy really called deism. You may not be remotely interested in this, but I'm going to tell you quickly anyway. Deism is the idea that God starts things off and then walks away and leaves them to their own devices. That's not the Bible's picture. Because alongside this idea of God creating a world that's got the ability to reproduce and grow and develop in itself, is the other strand in the Bible that Jesus in particular is the one who holds all things together, Colossians tells us. Hebrews tells us he's the one who sustains everything by the power of his word. Now there's an interesting thought. In Genesis 1, it's the word of the Father that creates the world. In Hebrews 1, it's the word of the Son that sustains the world, that holds all things together. So God isn't some absentee landlord who starts the thing and then leaves it to run down, but actually, and despite all that we see around us sometimes, Jesus, by the power of his word, of the words that he speaks, is sustaining the world, is holding it all together. He's making sure the balance of oxygen is right for us to breathe. He's making sure that the process of DNA reproduction works so that the right kinds of animals come, the right kinds of human beings come. Jesus is actively involved in his creation to this day. And one day he's going to bring about a new creation, which he will be just as actively involved in, which will be even better, which will be stamped with his fingerprints. It's an amazing world we live in, a world that God's designed to reproduce itself, to develop and grow, and a world that he is sustaining in Jesus. Now, one more thing to say about that is it's the word. God speaks, let there be light, let there be life. And Jesus speaks and holds it together. God says one more thing about this world in all its diversity and abundance. He says, after every day of creation, God saw what he'd made and he saw that it was good. We live in a good world, a world that's gone wrong, but sometimes as Christians, we can be too quick to focus on that. We'll get to Genesis 3 and everything going pear-shaped soon enough. But for now, let's rejoice that God has made a good world. And realise that coronavirus and all these things that go wrong in the world are part of what happens because of Genesis 3, because of the fall, because of sin, because of wrong choices at the spiritual and the human level. God's world was created good and diverse and abundant. Look at all the different species according to their kinds, repeated about the plants, the fish, the birds, the livestock, the animals. And the abundance, fill the air, fill the seas. God doesn't do things by half. He creates a full, vibrant, diverse world. During the lockdown period, we've had a little foster child and we've been going with him. He's 2, and one of his favourite things is to go and look at ducks. Now, I've suddenly learned in this period far more about the different varieties and species of wildfowl and birds in general than I've ever known. And it's fascinating, it's extraordinary. And he can stand for ages just watching them act and interact with each other and their behaviour. And we need to learn from that, to get that awe at God's amazing, good, diverse, vibrant creation back. Because God saw, and he saw that it was good. And he's made within it the potential to grow and develop and become more than he originally made it. And you know what? He's done that in you as well. When you became a Christian, when the Spirit of God entered your life, when God started his work of new creation in you, he didn't finish it. He began it. He planted the seed that can grow to become all that you will be when the new creation is complete. when actually the world will be as it should be and you will be everything God created you to be. We need to hold on to that in times when all we see are the negative, that one day there will be new creation that's perfect with all the sin and the injustice taken away, and one day you and me will be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Now that's a hope to hold on to. See you again soon.